Amid the rising casualties in Iraq, the United States is retooling its post-war strategy. But recent events are also raising questions about the state of the military overall and whether it's prepared to meet the challenges of future conflicts. And that's the subject of the new book, Transformation Under Fire, Revolutionizing How America Fights. The author is Douglas Macgregor, and he joins us now from Washington this morning. Colonel, good morning. Good to have you with us.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
You write in your book that America is at war, and war transforms armies. And I believe it's your argument that the transformation has not taken place yet.
No, it hasn't. We really haven't changed significantly at all in many, many decades. And we have an opportunity now because war is always a good antidote to fixed ideas.
I know that since you're affiliated with the Army right now, you can't talk about the current state of affairs and the changing strategy that we're witnessing, but you can talk about what happened up through May 1st. And what, in your opinion, did we learn from the war in Iraq during major combat? What can be changed?
Well, I think the first thing that we've learned is that some of the assumptions about the information that superior networking was going to provide are not really valid. We are not going to live in a world as soldiers where information is going to tell us everything we need to know about the enemy all the time, to the point where we can afford to trade away protection for information. That's the first part. The second part, I think, is that we can organize our capabilities to operate differently along the lines that Secretary Rumsfeld has advocated for a long time.
But there's been significant opposition to perhaps what Rumsfeld has suggested as far as transforming the Army in Washington.
Well, I think there's been a dialogue of the deaf. The various sides really haven't been listening to one another. They've assumed things that aren't necessarily true about the various sides. On one side, you have people with a great deal of faith in technology and its promise. On the other side, large numbers of people who are not willing to depart from the way they have done business for 40 or 50 years. We really live in the Army of 1942, albeit with some new equipment. And Secretary Rumsfeld has said he wants a new Army. He doesn't necessarily want entirely new equipment. It's how do we organize today's equipment, how do we organize today's soldiers to operate differently.
I know there was a lot of talk during major combat that we needed more troops on the ground, but when you talk about new strategy, you're not necessarily talking about numbers. In fact, you said numbers in some cases can be a moot point.
Exactly. The Army structure is really designed to deploy mass, not capability, and today mass does not necessarily equal capability. For instance, in the last campaign, we would have benefited from packages of armor, more armor up front and less light infantry. And at the same time, we would have benefited from a structure that would have allowed us to rotate more light infantry in later once the major hostilities culminating in the seizure of Baghdad had concluded. We weren't able to do that because we're organized as very large divisions on the 1942 model designed for a form of linear warfare that has vanished. Our enemies today are fragmented. The nature of the enemy is different. We have to be able to operate in a perimeter of 360 degrees, fighting in any direction, not simply one or two directions. So we've got to organize our forces to operate in smaller force packages that are designed to cope with this new environment of 360-degree warfare.
You talk about these fragmented enemies. We're seeing that both in Iraq right now and in Afghanistan as that continues as well, the conflict there. But you say one of our biggest enemies, as you point out, are the structures that maintain our Army, that remain in effect even since World War II.
Well, the policies for readiness and training go back decades, and they have to do with this assumption that if we fought in the future, we would mobilize millions of troops to fight another war on the scale of World War II, and we've been waiting around since 1947 to do that. We haven't done it because we're not going to fight World War II. And we've been through a series of conflicts that turned out to be very different from the Second World War. So it's time to build a professional combat force that exists in a state of readiness to deploy and fight wherever it's required to go, no longer wedded to one or two areas of the world, but to be prepared for what Secretary Rumsfeld has called global joint expeditionary warfare. We can do it. We have the soldiers for it, and today we have the largest reserve of experienced combat officers, soldiers, non-commissioned officers that we have ever had. And they are the people who can build this new force.
In fact, you have said that war does for armies what the marketplace does for business. Unfortunately, though, this isn't a business, and we're not talking about people's money. We're talking about their safety, in fact, the safety of the troops. So how do you get change? Because I know the Secretary of Defense has supported a lot of what you've said in this book, and still we're not seeing the change yet.
Well, change is a difficult process, and change is tied to people. People carry culture. Our cultural attitudes, our outlooks are really rooted in the past right now, and you've got to have serious and substantial change at the top. We have a new Chief of Staff, and the fact that I'm allowed to speak at all is a measure of his openness to change. But one man doesn't change everything, and if history is any guide, when we've had substantial change during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Korea, we had substantial turnover in leadership at the top.
And I know that there are differing opinions on some of what you say in the book. In fact, in talking before the interview, you had mentioned that you probably wouldn't have been able to write the book had it not been under the current administration. How were your ideas received under the Clinton administration and under a different secretary?
Well, the ideas were well received by Secretary Cohen, but there was no willingness on the part of the civilian leadership to challenge the conventional wisdom of the senior leadership of the Army, or for that matter of any other service. And I think that that's the difference. We have a civilian leadership that has raised serious questions and has challenged conventional wisdom. I think it's important to point out that Secretary Rumsfeld is being right.
Certainly there has been a lot of debate on the transformation of the U.S. Army, and you're contributing to that. We appreciate you for coming on the program this morning. Douglas Macgregor, Colonel Macgregor with the U.S. Army. And you're watching World News Now.